Jake Carter was a man used to getting what he wanted. Coming from a wealthy family, he had traveled to many countries, enjoying the finest hotels, the best restaurants, and the most luxurious experiences. When Jake heard about the historic palace in the heart of the city, he knew it was the perfect place to show off. His friends, a group of like-minded, confident travelers, were excited to see the royal guards that stood at attention in front of the palace. As they walked toward the entrance, Jake was already thinking of ways to make the most of his visit. He saw the royal guards, tall and motionless in their formal uniforms. The guards were part of the palace's security team, tasked with protecting the palace and its treasures. Their job was to stand perfectly still, no matter what the tourists did around them. This was something Jake had seen in photos and videos before. He thought it was silly, like a form of performance art. He wasn't impressed. Jake turned to his friends, and with a smirk, he said, "Look at them. They're like statues. It must be boring just standing there all day." His friends laughed, but a couple of them looked a little uncomfortable. They had been to many places, but something about the royal guards made them uneasy. There was something serious about their presence, something more than just a fun tourist attraction. But Jake wasn't one to back down from a challenge, especially when he had his friends by his side. He had a camera in his hand and was ready to take the perfect shot. But as he prepared his phone, Jake had a thought. What if I get a reaction out of them? He thought with a mischievous grin. He decided to have some fun. He began walking toward one of the guards, who stood perfectly still at his post. Jake didn't believe these guards were capable of reacting. After all, they looked like they were made of stone. He started to wave his hand in front of the guard's face, moving it back and forth to see if he would blink or react in any way. The crowd around him watched nervously, unsure of what was happening. Most people knew the guards wouldn't move. This was their job, after all. But they didn't know if Jake had gone too far. Jake laughed out loud when the guard didn't flinch. "I guess you are a statue," he said, turning to his friends. They giggled nervously, but a few people in the crowd were starting to get uncomfortable. They could tell this wasn't just a harmless joke. It was clear that Jake wasn't showing respect. Not getting the response he wanted, Jake decided to up the ante. He stepped closer to the guard, ignoring the small voice inside him that told him to stop. His friends were still laughing, and Jake felt encouraged. He thought, what's the worst that could happen? These guys are just doing their job, right? In the back of his mind, he knew he was taking a risk. But the excitement of the moment, the thrill of challenging the guards, made him feel invincible. He had no idea that what he was about to do would change everything. As Jake moved even closer, he couldn't resist. He raised his bottle of water, opened it, and splashed a little water on the guard's uniform. For a split second, everything around him seemed to stop. His friends gasped, and the onlookers fell silent. Jake's smile faded as he realized the situation was no longer funny. What he didn't know was that in the next 2 minutes, his world would be turned upside down. The sound of the water splashing on the Royal Guard's uniform echoed through the courtyard, and for a moment, everything was still. Jake stood there, his bottle of water still in his hand, staring at the guard. The people around him were silent, and even his friends, who had been laughing just moments ago, looked worried. They had no idea what would happen next. Jake's heart started to race. Had he gone too far? He wasn't sure, but the look on the guard's face told him that something was wrong. The guard hadn't moved an inch. He was still as rigid and disciplined as before. But Jake could sense the tension in the air. For the first time, he felt a bit uneasy. One of his friends, Sarah, whispered, "Jake, you shouldn't have done that. These guards don't take kindly to jokes like that." She looked around nervously, as if expecting someone to come over and speak to them. The other members of the group were starting to feel uncomfortable too. They had all heard stories of how serious the royal guards were, but they had never imagined that one of them would be the target of such behavior. Jake, trying to brush off the feeling of unease, smiled and said, "Relax, guys. I'm just having a bit of fun. No harm done." But deep down, he wasn't so sure anymore. He couldn't help but notice that people were starting to look at him differently. Some of the tourists were glancing at him disapprovingly, and a few even pulled out their phones, quietly recording the scene. Jake suddenly felt like the center of attention, but it wasn't the kind of attention he had hoped for. Before he could say anything else, a loud, commanding voice broke the silence. "What do you think you're doing?" Jake turned quickly and saw another royal guard approaching. This guard was taller than the one he had splashed, and his uniform was even more formal, with golden epaulets on his shoulders and a stern expression on his face. The crowd seemed to part as he walked toward Jake, his boots clicking sharply on the stone floor. The new guard didn't look amused. In fact, he looked downright angry. He stopped just in front of Jake, who immediately felt a knot form in his stomach. This guard wasn't like the first one. This one wasn't playing around. "You splashed water on a royal guard's uniform," the officer said firmly, his voice deep and commanding. "Do you have any idea what that means?" Jake's mouth went dry. He opened his mouth to speak but couldn't find the words. His earlier confidence was gone, replaced by a rising sense of dread. The onlookers had gone completely silent, watching the exchange with wide eyes. Jake felt all eyes on him, and for the first time, he realized just how serious this moment was. The guard didn't wait for Jake to respond. Instead, he stepped closer, towering over Jake, and said, "You've made a mistake, and now you'll pay the consequences." Jake's mind raced. He had thought that the guards would just laugh it off, maybe give him a warning. But this was different. He could tell that this wasn't just a matter of respect for tradition. It was something much more serious. His eyes darted around, looking for his friends, but they were too far away. He couldn't even hear them. He was alone in this, and he knew it. The guard's stern expression didn't soften. This was no longer just a joke. The tourists around him were no longer smiling. Some of them were whispering to each other, others still recording the scene. It was clear that Jake had crossed a line, and now he would have to face the consequences. Jake stood frozen, his heart pounding in his chest. The weight of the situation began to sink in, and the carefree confidence he had moments ago disappeared. The royal guard, now standing just inches away, had a look of complete seriousness on his face. The silence in the air was so thick that Jake could almost hear his own heartbeat. The crowd had gathered around, some of them staring in shock, others whispering to each other. Phones were raised, capturing every moment of what was unfolding. Jake realized that his harmless prank had turned into something far more serious, and it was happening in front of an audience. As the guard continued to stand there, Jake felt a rush of regret. What had he done? He had been so caught up in trying to get a reaction, trying to make a joke, that he hadn't stopped to think about the consequences. Now, everything had changed. It wasn't just a splash of water. It was a disrespectful act towards someone who was, without a doubt, more than just a figure standing still. Jake realized that the guards were not there to entertain him. They were there to serve a much bigger purpose. The officer's voice broke the silence. "You don't seem to understand the seriousness of this," he said coldly, his gaze unwavering. "This is not a game, and it's certainly not a place for childish pranks." The officer's tone was calm but firm, and it made Jake feel small, as if he were a child being scolded. Jake opened his mouth to explain, to offer an apology, but nothing came out. He couldn't find the right words. The earlier bravado had completely vanished, leaving him standing there feeling foolish and out of place. He had always believed that money and status could get him out of any situation. But here, in front of the royal guard, he realized that respect was something he couldn't buy. The officer took a step closer and said, "You've just disrespected a symbol of this country, and now you'll need to make things right." Jake's eyes widened, and his stomach churned. He could feel the weight of his mistake pressing down on him. He wasn't sure what would happen next, but he could tell that this was far from over. As the officer's words sank in, Jake looked over at his friends. They were standing at a distance, their expressions a mix of shock and concern. Sarah, the one who had warned him earlier, had her hand over her mouth, likely regretting that she had encouraged Jake's antics. The others were too embarrassed to speak up. No one had expected this. The royal guard then turned toward the crowd. "This man needs to understand the importance of respect for the history and traditions of this place," he said, his voice booming. "This is not something to be taken lightly." Jake's face turned red. He was mortified. People were staring at him, and the reality of what he had done was starting to set in. His mind raced, trying to think of a way to make things right, but he couldn't come up with anything. He wished he could take it all back, but it was too late. Apologize. The officer's command was simple, but its weight was undeniable. Jake's pride screamed at him not to give in, but the seriousness of the situation left him with no other choice. He opened his mouth, but the words felt heavy, stuck in his throat. How could he apologize for something he had thought was just a joke? Jake knew he needed to do something before it was too late to fix the mess he had created. Jake stood there, feeling trapped, as the royal guard's stern gaze never left him. The crowd around him grew quiet, the air thick with tension. For the first time in his life, Jake felt completely out of control. He had been in tough situations before, but none like this. His usual confidence had completely disappeared, replaced by a sense of deep unease. The officer's words echoed in Jake's mind, growing louder with each passing second. "This man needs to understand the importance of respect," he had said. The realization hit him hard. What he had thought would be a harmless prank was now a serious matter. He had disrespected not just the royal guard, but a symbol of something much bigger. And now he was stuck with the consequences. His eyes darted around, searching for an escape, but there was none. The people who had once been part of his audience now looked at him with pity or judgment, as if they could already see the outcome. Jake could feel his pride slipping away, and for a brief moment, he wished he could just disappear. He had always been the center of attention, but now it wasn't the kind of attention he wanted. The officer took a step forward, his boots clicking against the stone floor, each sound like a hammer striking a nail. He stopped just a few feet away from Jake, his posture as straight as the stone statues that surrounded the palace. His eyes were sharp, unwavering, as if he could see right through Jake's bravado. "Do you realize the seriousness of what you've done?" the officer asked. His voice was calm, but full of authority. Jake opened his mouth to speak, but the words stuck in his throat. What could he possibly say? The reality of the situation was sinking in. There was no excuse for what he had done, and now he had to face the consequences. "You have to kneel and apologize," the officer commanded, his tone leaving no room for argument. Jake's heart skipped a beat. Kneel? Was he being serious? He had never imagined something like this would happen to him. He was used to getting away with things, used to having power and influence. But this wasn't something money or status could fix. The officer didn't wait for a response. He simply motioned to Jake to kneel. For a brief moment, Jake hesitated. His pride screamed at him to refuse, to stand tall and defiant. But as he looked around at the serious faces of the crowd and the guards who stood like towering figures, he knew he had no choice. He wasn't in control anymore. The only way out of this was to show respect, to humble himself. With a deep sigh, Jake slowly sank to his knees. The movement felt unnatural, as if the very act of kneeling went against everything he had ever known. The crowd watched, some with sympathy, others with a sense of approval. Jake's face flushed with embarrassment as he tried to steady his breath. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice quieter than he intended. The words felt heavy on his tongue, but they were the only ones that could make this nightmare end. "I didn't mean any disrespect." The officer's expression softened slightly, though his gaze remained firm. "It's not enough just to say the words. You have to understand why they matter." Jake nodded, realizing that the apology wasn't just for the guard, it was for the history and tradition he had disrespected. The lesson was harsh, but it was clear. He needed to show true respect, not just speak the words. And only then would this uncomfortable situation come to an end. Jake remained on his knees, his heart still racing as he felt the eyes of the crowd on him. The officer's stern gaze made it clear that this was not something to take lightly. He had never felt so vulnerable in his life. Normally, Jake was the one in charge, the one who called the shots. But now, he was powerless, kneeling before a royal guard, his mind spinning with confusion and embarrassment. The crowd, which had once been full of laughter and excitement, now seemed to be holding its breath. People stood at a distance, watching intently, their eyes shifting between Jake and the officer. Some were recording the scene on their phones, no doubt to share it online later. Jake could feel the weight of the moment. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about respect for a tradition he had completely overlooked. For a few moments, no one spoke. The silence was deafening, broken only by the sound of footsteps as the officer moved around Jake. The tension was thick, and Jake's mind raced as he tried to figure out what would happen next. Would the officer call for security? Would he be escorted out of the palace grounds? Jake didn't know, but whatever it was, he knew it wouldn't be good. He had never imagined that his silly prank would lead to something like this. Finally, the officer spoke, his voice calm but firm. "You may not realize it, but your actions have consequences. This is not just a show or a performance for tourists. The Royal Guard is part of something much larger, something with history, honor, and duty. And when you treat it as a joke, you disrespect all of that." Jake swallowed hard. The officer's words hit him like a ton of bricks. He had never thought about the guards in such a deep way. To him, they had always seemed like part of the tourist experience, standing still, looking serious, but ultimately just there to add to the grandeur of the palace. He had never considered the history and significance behind their role. The officer continued, his eyes never leaving Jake. "You've made a mockery of what the guards stand for. And while you may think it's just a harmless joke, it's not. It affects everyone who values this place and its traditions." Jake nodded slowly, finally beginning to understand. He hadn't just made a mistake. He had insulted something that others held dear. And now, it seemed like there was no way to take it back. Jake felt the heat of embarrassment rise in his chest as he thought about how his friends must be feeling. They had all been laughing earlier, but now they were as uncomfortable as he was. Sarah, the one who had tried to warn him earlier, stood at the back of the group, her face full of concern. She had always been the more cautious one, and now Jake realized she had been right all along. The officer didn't wait for Jake to respond. "You'll need to leave the palace grounds now," he said, his tone still firm but not unkind. "But let this be a lesson to you. Respect is earned, not given. It's something you must show to others, especially when you are a guest in their country." Jake's face burned with shame as he stood up, his legs a little shaky. He had learned a valuable lesson, but it had come at a high cost. He could hear the whispers of the crowd as he walked away, and he knew that this moment would stick with him forever. It was a harsh reminder that actions had consequences, and that no one was above showing respect. Jake walked away from the royal guard with his head hanging low, his body heavy with shame. He had never imagined that his little prank could spiral into something so serious. The weight of the officer's words kept echoing in his mind. "Respect is earned, not given," he had said. Jake had thought of himself as someone deserving of respect, but now, in this moment, he realized how wrong he had been. His arrogance had gotten the best of him, and now he was paying the price. As he moved through the crowd, Jake could feel the eyes of the onlookers burning into him. It was as though the entire world had seen him fall from his pedestal. The whispers of the tourists around him only added to the growing sense of discomfort. They spoke in hushed tones, some shaking their heads in disbelief, while others seemed to mutter words of sympathy for the royal guard. Jake felt exposed, like a performer on stage who had forgotten their lines. His friends, who had been laughing earlier, now stood silently behind him. Sarah was the first to approach him, her face full of concern. She had been the one who had warned him not to provoke the guards, but it had been too late to take back the water he had splashed. "Jake, you really messed up this time," she said quietly, her voice filled with a mix of disappointment and regret. "You need to think before you act." Jake didn't reply right away. He didn't know what to say. What could he say? The realization of how thoughtless his actions had been was finally sinking in. He had tried to make a joke at someone else's expense, but now he was the one who was the joke. The worst part was that it wasn't just his friends who had witnessed his humiliation. It was everyone around them. Everyone had seen the arrogant tourist fall flat on his face. "I didn't mean for it to go this far," Jake muttered, his voice barely audible. Sarah looked at him with sympathy but didn't offer any words of comfort. It was clear that this wasn't just about being embarrassed anymore. It was about the fact that Jake had crossed a line. Respect was something more important than he had ever realized. As Jake continued to walk, the weight of the crowd's gaze seemed to follow him. Some tourists even stepped aside, making sure to give him space as he passed. He couldn't help but feel the sting of judgment in every step he took. For the first time, he understood what it felt like to be on the receiving end of criticism, to be the one everyone was watching with a mix of pity and disapproval. But the most humiliating part was that this wasn't something that would be forgotten quickly. People would talk about it, and soon, the video of him splashing water on the guard would be shared all over social media. It wasn't just about being scolded by the officer. It was about the whole world seeing him fail in such a public way. As Jake reached the exit of the palace grounds, he couldn't help but think about what the officer had said earlier. "You've made a mockery of something much bigger than yourself." Jake had taken it lightly at first, but now he saw how true those words were. He had not only embarrassed himself, but he had disrespected something that meant a lot to others. The Royal Guard was a symbol of duty, history, and tradition, things far bigger than his ego. Jake walked away from the Royal Guard with his head hanging low, his body heavy with shame. He had never imagined that his little prank could spiral into something so serious. The weight of the officer's words kept echoing in his mind. "Respect is earned, not given," he had said. Jake had thought of himself as someone deserving of respect, but now, in this moment, he realized how wrong he had been. His arrogance had gotten the best of him, and now he was paying the price. As he moved through the crowd, Jake could feel the eyes of the onlookers burning into him. It was as though the entire world had seen him fall from his pedestal. The whispers of the tourists around him only added to the growing sense of discomfort. They spoke in hushed tones, some shaking their heads in disbelief, while others seemed to mutter words of sympathy for the Royal Guard. Jake felt exposed, like a performer on stage who had forgotten their lines. His friends, who had been laughing earlier, now stood silently behind him. Sarah was the first to approach him, her face full of concern. She had been the one who had warned him not to provoke the guards, but it had been too late to take back the water he had splashed. "Jake, you really messed up this time," she said quietly, her voice filled with a mix of disappointment and regret. "You need to think before you act." Jake didn't reply right away. He didn't know what to say. What could he say? The realization of how thoughtless his actions had been was finally sinking in. He had tried to make a joke at someone else's expense, but now he was the one who was the joke. The worst part was that it wasn't just his friends who had witnessed his humiliation. It was everyone around them. Everyone had seen the arrogant tourist fall flat on his face. "I didn't mean for it to go this far," Jake muttered, his voice barely audible. Sarah looked at him with sympathy, but didn't offer any words of comfort. It was clear that this wasn't just about being embarrassed anymore. It was about the fact that Jake had crossed a line. Respect was something more important than he had ever realized. As Jake continued to walk, the weight of the crowd's gaze seemed to follow him. Some tourists even stepped aside, making sure to give him space as he passed. He couldn't help but feel the sting of judgment in every step he took. For the first time, he understood what it felt like to be on the receiving end of criticism, to be the one everyone was watching with a mix of pity and disapproval. But the most humiliating part was that this wasn't something that would be forgotten quickly. People would talk about it. And soon, the video of him splashing water on the guard would be shared all over social media. It wasn't just about being scolded by the officer. It was about the whole world seeing him fail in such a public way. As Jake reached the exit of the palace grounds, he couldn't help but think about what the officer had said earlier. "You've made a mockery of something much bigger than yourself." Jake had taken it lightly at first, but now he saw how true those words were. He had not only embarrassed himself, but he had disrespected something that meant a lot to others. The Royal Guard was a symbol of duty, history, and tradition, things far bigger than his ego. He took a deep breath and sighed. This wasn't the kind of lesson he had wanted, but it was one that would stick with him forever. It was a lesson in humility, in understanding that not everything was a joke, and that sometimes respect wasn't something you could demand. It had to be given and earned through your actions. The days after the incident at the palace were difficult for Jake. Every time he thought about it, the humiliation he felt returned. He tried to distract himself by checking his phone, but the video of him splashing water on the Royal Guard had already gone viral. It was everywhere, on social media, in news reports, and even in messages from people he knew. His friends joked about it, but there was no laughing for Jake. He could barely look at himself in the mirror without feeling embarrassed. It wasn't just the public embarrassment that hurt, it was the deeper realization that he had been wrong. He had always prided himself on being confident and bold, thinking that he could get away with anything because of his status. But now, all that confidence seemed misplaced. The truth was, he had disrespected something much bigger than himself. Jake had spent the last few days thinking about what had happened, trying to make sense of it. He thought back to the words of the officer who had said, "Respect is earned, not given." At the time, Jake hadn't fully understood what that meant. He had always been someone who believed that respect was something you could demand. After all, he had money, power, and influence, things that people typically respected. But now, standing in the quiet of his own thoughts, Jake realized that respect wasn't something you could buy. It wasn't something you could force others to give you. Respect had to be earned through your actions, and that's what he had failed to do. In the days following the incident, Jake tried to learn more about the Royal Guard, the palace, and the tradition they represented. He visited a museum nearby that explained the history of the guards, showing their role in protecting the royal family and maintaining the country's safety. Jake had never cared much for history before, but now he understood how deeply the people of the country valued the Royal Guard's duty. These guards weren't just standing still for show. They were part of a long tradition of service and sacrifice. And yet, Jake had treated that tradition like a joke. As he walked through the museum, reading about the history of the guards and their important role in the country, Jake couldn't help but feel a sense of guilt. He had dismissed the significance of what they represented, seeing it as a simple tourist attraction. But now, after learning more about it, he saw how wrong he had been. He realized that he hadn't just embarrassed himself. He had disrespected an entire culture, an entire nation. And that, more than anything else, was what weighed on him the most. After his visit to the museum, Jake decided to do something to make things right. He wrote a letter, an apology letter. He addressed it to the Royal Guard and the people of the country, expressing his deep regret for his actions and the disrespect he had shown. In the letter, Jake explained how he had learned from his mistake and how he would never take the guards, their history, or their service for granted again. He knew that no letter could undo the harm he had caused, but he hoped it would show that he was genuinely sorry. When Jake finally sent the letter, it felt like a small but important step toward redemption. It was a way for him to show that he had learned something valuable from the experience, something that would stay with him for the rest of his life. Jake realized that respect wasn't just about following rules or showing politeness. It was about understanding and appreciating the things that others hold dear. And in that moment, he knew that he had learned the hardest, yet most important, lesson of all. Jake sat in his hotel room, staring at his phone. He had just sent the apology letter to the Royal Guard, but it didn't feel like enough. The incident had already gone viral, and now it seemed like the entire world had seen him splashing water on a Royal Guard and then kneeling in embarrassment. As he scrolled through social media, he saw hundreds of comments, both mocking him and offering advice. Some people called him an arrogant tourist, others simply shook their heads at his behavior. The video was everywhere, and with every new comment, Jake felt the sting of public judgment. The thing that bothered him the most wasn't just that people were laughing at him. It was that many of them weren't just criticizing the prank, but the disrespectful attitude he had shown toward the Royal Guard and the country's traditions. The comments ranged from jokes to serious critiques. Some people seemed to understand that he had made a mistake, while others were furious, accusing him of being ignorant of the culture and history of the country. One comment stood out to Jake. "Respect is not something you can demand, it's something you give. Hope you learn that next time." Jake couldn't help but reflect on that message. He had always thought of himself as someone who earned respect through his actions and his status, but this experience had shown him that respect wasn't something you could force people to give you. It had to come naturally, through how you treated others, especially when you were in someone else's country or culture. Respect had to be earned by showing others that you valued them and their traditions. The more he read, the more Jake realized that his mistake had gone beyond just splashing water on a guard. It was about how he treated people when they were in a position where they couldn't fight back, especially those in jobs or roles that were seen as important to the nation's history. And now he had to live with the consequences. Despite the negative comments, some people did offer words of encouragement. There were a few who expressed understanding, saying that Jake seemed genuinely remorseful. Some even suggested that he could turn this embarrassing situation into an opportunity to learn more about the country and its traditions. It gave Jake a small sense of hope. He knew he couldn't undo what he had done, but he could try to make it right. Jake wasn't used to feeling like this, like the whole world was watching him, waiting for him to make a mistake. But he realized that the lesson was important. This wasn't just about him. It was about how others viewed him, how they saw his respect for their culture and their rules. He knew that if he truly wanted to make things right, he would have to show more than just words. He needed to demonstrate his respect through actions. The day after reading through the comments, Jake decided to take action. He contacted a local charity that worked to preserve the country's cultural heritage and offered to make a donation in the name of the Royal Guard. It wasn't much, but Jake hoped it would be a small step toward showing that he had learned from his mistake. It wasn't just about apologizing anymore. It was about showing that he respected the people and the culture that had taught him such a valuable lesson. As Jake sent the donation, he realized that this experience would stay with him for a long time. It had been painful, yes, but it had also been a wake-up call, a lesson in humility, respect, and the importance of understanding others. And while the internet's judgment had been harsh, it had forced him to see things in a new light. The story of the proud, arrogant tourist who became humble was a story he would never forget. And hopefully, neither would the people who had witnessed his fall. Weeks had passed since the embarrassing incident at the palace, but Jake couldn't shake the feeling that it was still haunting him. The video of him splashing water on the Royal Guard had spread like wildfire, and though the noise had quieted down a little, it felt like every time he saw a new comment or mention of it, the humiliation returned. But despite the discomfort, Jake knew that something inside him had changed. He had taken the lessons seriously, much more seriously than he ever expected. Respect. It was a word that kept echoing in his mind. He had never really thought about what respect meant before. He thought it was something you got when you were important, something you demanded with power and influence. But now he realized that respect had to be earned through your actions, through how you treated others, and how you valued the traditions and customs of those around you. Jake had learned that lesson the hard way. His behavior had been disrespectful, and it had caused him to lose more than just face. It had shown him the difference between being respected and earning respect. He had spent days reflecting on his actions, reading books about the country's history, and even visiting museums to understand the deeper significance of what he had done. He had truly come to appreciate the role the Royal Guard played in the country's identity and what it meant for the people who took pride in their heritage. One evening, Jake sat in his hotel room, watching the sunset through the window. For the first time in a long while, he felt a sense of peace. The nagging sense of embarrassment had faded, replaced by something more important, a sense of understanding. He knew he couldn't undo what had happened, but he had done everything he could to make things right. The letter to the Royal Guard, the donation to the Cultural Preservation Charity, it was all part of his effort to right the wrong he had made. He thought about how things had changed since that day. His friends had noticed the difference in him. Sarah, especially, had been a bit distant after the incident, unsure of how to talk to Jake about what had happened. But now, they were closer than before. She had seen him take responsibility for his actions, and she had watched him grow from it. One afternoon, Sarah approached Jake with a small smile. "You know," she said, "I think you really have changed. I didn't think you would actually take it this seriously, but I'm proud of you." Jake nodded, feeling a weight lift off his shoulders. He wasn't looking for praise or approval. He knew the journey wasn't over, and the respect he had gained wasn't something that could be easily measured. It wasn't about impressing people or proving a point. It was about being better, being someone who understood the importance of respecting others. As Jake packed his bags and prepared to leave the country, he felt a sense of gratitude. The trip had started off with pride, arrogance, and a sense of entitlement. But it had ended with a lesson in humility and respect, one that he would carry with him for the rest of his life. The video of the Royal Guard incident might have lived on in the memories of the people who witnessed it, but Jake was no longer the same person who had been caught in the middle of it. Respect had become more than just a word for him. It had become a guiding principle. And in that, he had found something more valuable than any status, power, or public approval. He had found growth, and that was something that no video or comment could take away.